Next on KQED Newsroom, in the wake of the Isla Vista rampage, new state proposals target helping the mentally ill and limiting access to guns. Congresswoman Jackie Speier on the front lines of efforts to curb sexual assaults at university campuses.
20% of the co-eds on campus will either be sexually assaulted or they will have an attempt of sexual assault on them during their college career.
And remembering Maya Angelou, an intimate look at how friendships shaped her life.
Friendship, it keeps you alive, it keeps you awake, it keeps you trying to be the best.
Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. As the community of Isla Vista mourns the deadly rampage last weekend has reinvigorated calls for legislative action. This morning in Washington, Bay Area Congressman Mike Thompson announced his proposal to target mental health services and reduce gun violence.
People with mental illness are more apt to be the victim of violence than the perpetrator of violence. But nonetheless, there are some things that we can do that will make our communities safer.
Earlier in the week, California Senate Democrats rolled out budget proposals to improve mental health care in the criminal justice system and expand training for law enforcement.
It's a cruel and, of course, a sad coincidence that the significance of one proposal to improve training among frontline law enforcement to recognize the warning signs of mental illness was illustrated by a gun rampage in Santa Barbara County.
And restricting access to guns for people deemed mentally ill is the focus of a new bill in the state assembly. Joining me now for a look at how these proposals would work are April Demboski, KQED News health reporter, Frank Zimring, UC Berkeley Law School professor, and Josh Richman, Bay Area News Group political reporter. Josh, let's begin with you. California's gun control laws are among the strictest in the nation. Give us an idea of the legal landscape here. What are some of the significant gun laws already in place? And how would this week's new proposals enhance all that?
Yeah, well, it's a very complex landscape because it's the product of decades of legislation and very often bills that were passed in the wake of incidents such as this that sort of galvanized action in Sacramento. But yes, we have overall one of the strictest schemes. We have a 10-day waiting period for gun purchases. We have registration of handguns. We have a requirement that all sales go through licensed dealers and that all sales, even if it's person to person through a licensed dealer, involve a background check, which is more extensive than the national background check. We have an assault weapons ban. We have a ban on the sale of ammunition magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. You can only buy a handgun from a roster of state-approved handguns. So it goes on and on and on. There are a lot of restrictions that are put on.
And yet something like this still happened. So with these new laws, do you think it would change anything?
Well, it's unclear because, I mean, you, in this situation, you're dealing with a troubled, mentally ill young man, but yet one who had never committed a crime before, one who had never acted violently before, one who did not have a history of commitment for his mental issues or anything like that. And so it's not entirely clear exactly what would have helped in a situation like this. The officers who went to visit him at his mother's request last month did not check the dealer record of sale handgun database, which would have told them that he had bought 3 handguns recently. But it's not standard for them to do so in a situation like that unless there's been a specific threat of violence. So, you know, I think what you're seeing now is more of a concentration on the mental health issues. Darrell Steinberg has long been a champion of mental health issues, of better spending, of better planning for that. And I think you would have seen these bills coming forth anyway. It just so happens that it happened to follow this horrible thing that happened.
And then we have, of course, Berkeley Assemblywoman Nancy Skinner, who is proposing the so-called gun violence restraining order, April. And this targets specifically very much the mental health issue. Talk about what it will do, and do you think it will make a difference?
Well, I think there's a lot of questions around whether Skinner's bill really can make a difference. I think what Skinner wants to do is basically we have current laws now where if someone with a mental illness says to their therapist that they are thinking about causing harm to themselves or to another person, that there are some requirements around when a therapist will have to report that either to mental health officials in the county or law enforcement. And what Skinner wants to do is expand that power to family members to alert authorities around whether or not, for someone who they think might be prone to cause harm.
And I would imagine there are quite a few civil liberties concerns with that.
Well, first of all, there are a lot of law enforcement efficiency concerns, and there are a lot of civil liberties concerns. The problem that we see portrayed very accurately in the Santa Barbara setting is that the police and the parents are strangers. That's a voice over the phone. So one possibility is that the young man has serious emotional difficulties. Another possibility is that the mother on the phone has serious emotional difficulties. Put yourself in the position of the police officer. How do you arbitrate those? How much do you invest in the investigation of worried parents? At least when you're dealing with professional therapists, you have some quality control at the outside. But the other problem that you have at the outside there is that the more you make therapeutic professionals, agencies of law enforcement or investigation or labeling of the people they treat, the more often the truly mentally ill are going to try and stay the hell away from them. So that you have a real counter-deterrence.
And that's a really interesting point about Darrell Steinberg. We heard a little bit from him at the opening. Part of his proposal this week is to expand spending on training of law enforcement officers. And that's partly in recognition of the fact that they are the first responders, and increasingly people with mental illness are in prisons and jail and in contact with the criminal justice system. But it does raise a really interesting question about, if a police officer comes to your door, are you going to open up about concerns you have about your mental health? Probably not. I mean, as a society, we kind of learn to fear law enforcement. And so I think, some of the people who are opposed to some of this spending are arguing, let's reinvest that money so, a social worker shows up at your door.
Well, it may be worse than that, by the way. There may be millions of people who are willing to tell the police all their troubles, but I don't think those are the most dangerous people in society. When you're planning to become a mass murderer, you're not necessarily going to put your arm around a policeman and make a full confession.
It's hard for licensed therapists to recognize that sometimes, especially in the 10 or 15 minute window that an officer at the door might have, or, in this case, what they had with this young man in Santa Barbara. It's hard to imagine the degree of training you could give police and deputies that would enable them to really see this with any great consistency.
And we should also point out that cases like these are the ones that grab national headlines, but the reality is that a very small percentage of violent acts are committed by the mentally ill, only 4% of the violent acts in this country. So that you have that whole stigma issue as well. Do we want to stigmatize the mentally ill? But I want to get back to the civil liberties issue with you, Frank, and that is, what are the civil liberties concerns here with something like the restraining order proposal, and how do you strike that balance between public safety and individual liberties?
Okay, well, it turns out to be a more peculiar problem in the United States. And the reason for that is that firearms ownership is part of an ordinary citizen's civil liberty here. With regard to handguns, the issue isn't that in the United Kingdom. It isn't that in the city of New York under the Sullivan Act, because ordinary citizens are not entitled to have handguns. But as soon as what we're saying is that while we're going to regulate access to some extent and require waiting periods, everybody can have all the guns he or she wants, what you have done is define into citizenship what is a potentially dangerous aspect of owning and using firearms, and then whomever it is that you're trying to separate from access to a gun can feel aggrieved and stigmatized in the doing of it.
But let me play devil's advocate for a minute. Gun rights advocates will say it's not the guns that are the issue, it's the people who have the guns.
Well, it's both. It's very, very difficult to shoot somebody without a gun, and it's very, very difficult to have a murder without an offender. It's the combination, however, of the wrong people and the dangerous weapons, and that's the same combination that everybody sees in developed countries all over the world. The public choice that we've made, and the we in this case is even California, is not to try and make restrictive access to most firearms, including handguns. And one price of that is that our capacities to, in that case, restrict ownership and use possibilities to anyone is greatly reduced. And the stigma that goes with being not eligible to own a gun is much greater in the United States.
And let's remember that in this case, 3 people died as a result of a knife being used as the weapon, not a gun. And I take your point about stigma very seriously, because incidents like this, I'm not sure any legislation could necessarily prevent, freak incidents like this. But a lot of my concern about a lot of the proposals that are being made is that they inadvertently stigmatize people with mental illness. And I think one of the concerns we need to look at as a society is how do we destigmatize mental illness so that people feel comfortable getting help? Because one of the themes from this story is that this young man had access to mental health services, but he didn't want to take medication. He didn't want to pursue them.
And it's definitely a debate that is very much growing nationally now. Much sadness and mourning at UC Santa Barbara and the surrounding community, obviously. But I want to thank you all for being here. Josh Richman, April Dembosky, and Frank Zimring.
Thank you.
Another issue that universities across the country have been grappling with is sexual assault. A recent White House task force referred to sexual violence on campuses as an epidemic affecting 1 in 5 college women. Vice President Joe Biden calls for greater accountability by university leadership.
Support, and we need to bring perpetrators to justice. And we need the college and university to step up and learn the lessons which we have learned in the implementation of the Violence Against Women Act on the criminal side.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Office of Civil Rights is investigating complaints from more than 50 campuses across the country, including UC Berkeley, which is also the subject of a state probe. Scott Schaefer recently sat down with San Mateo County Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who says she will introduce legislation in the coming weeks to address the issue.
Congresswoman Speier, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
At its core, what is this issue about sexual assault on campus? What's it really about when you just break it all down?
It is about a climate of tolerance for sexual assault at university campuses that is indefensible. When you realize that 20% of the co-eds on campus will either be sexually assaulted or they will have an attempt of sexual assault on them during their college career, it's a chilling number. And I think for any parent sending a young woman off to college in particular, that's a deep concern.
And just to be clear, we're talking about rape, attempted rape, physical abuse.
It is sexual assault, and sexual assault includes rape, it includes an attempted rape, and it also includes unwanted sexual contact.
Yeah, and so these 55 schools, which includes the University of California, Berkeley, who are on this list that the White House released, the Department of Education released, what's the commonality there? They're all being investigated, but there's no inference of guilt or innocence. It's just that there are some concerns about how seriously they've handled these complaints.
If it's gone to the state of being investigated, then there's some serious concerns. So they have had irregularities in the way they have actually handled these cases. About 62 or 63% of the universities around the country are shirking their responsibilities as it relates to properly investigating and handling sexual assault cases.
And what does that mean? That they're not taking it seriously, that they don't have the resources to take it seriously, that they're not being transparent, they're not sharing the information? I mean, it seems like there could be a lot of ways in which the investigations would be inadequate or suspect.
All of those, but probably most of them are because they have not properly investigated the cases. In one of the cases at UC Berkeley, the victim survivor told me that she was never interviewed. So she files the complaint, there is some action taken against the assailant, but no one ever interviewed her. So how can you really have a comprehensive investigation if you don't even actually interview the victim?
Is it complicated by the fact that these things are happening on campus and that the campus and the university are responsible as opposed to, say, the local police department? Or should the local police department be brought in? I mean, where does the responsibility begin and end?
Well, that's a good question, because if it is, in fact, a violent felony that's been committed, it's not something that the university should handle exclusively. But certainly, the university has a responsibility to do an investigation, take action against the assailant, and then appropriately refer these cases to local law enforcement.
Is there some sort of pressure, do you think, that might prevent a school or discourage a school from taking the appropriate steps?
I think historically there has been an unwillingness to necessarily take these cases seriously. Oh, there was alcohol involved, or it was he said, she said. And the truth is that most of these predators actually attack 6 victims on a campus before they're finally curtailed in their activity.
Sometimes, not always, but some of these alleged assailants could be athletes. Many schools get a lot of money and prestige from sports and the donors that follow that. Is that an issue? Does that get mixed in with this at all, do you think?
I think the athlete rape situation is handled in an inappropriate way in many circumstances. There is an effort to minimize the reporting, somehow make it go away, find some other means by which to handle the situation. Oftentimes we find out after the fact, after the season is over, as most recently was found out at the University of Oregon, where after the season's over, they are now told that they're no longer going to be on the team.
You, of course, before this, were very involved in the issue of sexual assaults in the military. Do you see, what's the parallel here? What's the overlap?
The parallels are striking. And my work on sexual assault in the military actually was the motivation to actually move on to look at sexual assault on college campuses. They're closed systems. They have their own code, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and then the Code of Student Conduct, and they have their own law enforcement. And that formula creates an environment where I think many of these cases haven't been handled in a serious manner.
And in terms of the recommendations and the legislation that you're promoting, that you're sponsoring, what needs to happen?
I think transparency is a huge part of it. I think that if there's an investigation ongoing, if there's been a complaint filed, if there's been a resolution, that should all be made available to the public. I think we need to make sure there are the appropriate resources on the college campuses in terms of counseling the victims and also taking the rape tests. Believe it or not, UC does not even have the rape kits on campus. They were told at UC Berkeley to go to Highlands Hospital to be tested, and that's unacceptable.
And so the legislation that you're promoting, that you're sponsoring, will codify some of the recommendations that the White House is already running with?
That's correct. They're codifying actually our original recommendations. So we're very pleased that they've created a website called notalone.org, and that is going to be a great resource for victim survivors. And I think for the most part, young women, and most of these are co-eds, although 6% are male. And by the way, 70% of the LGBT community is sexually harassed in college campuses too. So it's important to point that out. I think they didn't know where they should turn. And the reason why the universities take this very seriously is that if Title IX files an action against you and finds you not in compliance, then you can lose all your federal funding. So that means Pell Grants, that means student loans, that means research grants. So it's a big hammer for the universities.
Certainly gotten the attention of the universities across the country. Congresswoman Speier, thank you so much for helping to bring it to light and for coming in to talk about it.
This week, the world lost a cultural and civil rights icon, poet Maya Angelou, who died at age 86. In her memory, we'd like to share an excerpt of a story from KQED's archives. Belva Davis, who hosted KQED's This Week in Northern California, was a longtime friend of Angelou. Davis spoke with the author in 2012 about the power and beauty of friendship.
Her life has been populated with friends, and there have been many famous ones, from civil rights activist Malcolm X to Oprah Winfrey. Yet some of her closest friends have included people not as well known.
You once explained to me the difference between friends and acquaintances. Would you share that with us?
Friendship, it keeps you alive, it keeps you awake, it keeps you trying to be the best. And in the middle of the night, when you're lonely and feel most at odds with yourself and with life and even with God, you can call a friend.
Author, singer, performer, actress, dancer, and composer. Angelou's achievements have spanned more than 4 decades. She's also a filmmaker.
We're very proud of that aircraft.
I'm very proud too. I think all Black Americans who see this will be very proud too.
In 1968, she wrote, produced, and narrated a documentary series for KQED about the African American experience called Blacks, Blues, Black. Here at her home in North Carolina, her garden is filled with friends.
If you walk around your house, there are friends in almost every room, your library, hundreds of books. Talk about the friends from these books.
I'm a product of the men and women who went before me, and I'm grateful to them. The writers who informed me, James Baldwin, of course, Shakespeare, of course, John Killens, Amiri Baraka. Books meant so much to me. I spent 7 years of my life as a mute, but I read everything, and I memorized everything. So many writers, I absorbed them, and they still inform my life.
Books not only helped her gain her voice, but transformed her path. Encouraged by her good friend James Baldwin, she wrote her first novel, the autobiographical I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, in 1968. Since then, she's written everything from poems to children's books to cookbooks. In 1992, her poetry reached millions of Americans at President Bill Clinton's inauguration.
Across the wall of the world, a river sings a beautiful song. It says, "Come, rest here by my side."
And while her writing continues to inspire audiences of all generations, her impact doesn't end there.
You've spent your life helping others, reaching out, supporting, including me. Why do you do that? What motivates you inside with your celebrity status that you feel you still need to reach back?
I owe it to another person to say what I've learned. I think that each one of us lives in direct relation to the heroes and sheroes we have, always and in always. And you have to have enough courage to be a hero, shero. Courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can be anything erratically, kind, fair, true, generous, blah, blah, blah. But to be that thing time after time, you have to have courage.
Angelou believes that we all have a hero or a shero inside of us. One of her heroes is the Reverend Cecil Williams, who leads Glide Memorial Church's program to serve the poor. Her advice to young and old is the same, an impassioned call to be courageous.
You have to use your art to speak back. You must do it, and continue to do it as well as you can. And ask God, the Creator, to encourage you to be more creative. And the poet says that each of us comes from the creation, trailing wisps of glory. This is what we have to do constantly. Don't give up. Don't give in. Give.
I asked her, what keeps her creating, doing, being?
I'm blessed, and I'm now celebrating my 84th year on this earth. It's a blessing to be of use. Anybody who can't be of use is useless. I will not be abused, I will not be misused, but I will be of use.
Recently, Maya Angelou shared an honor with other humanitarians, like Mother Teresa and her friend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the historic unveiling of Remember Them, Champions for Humanity at the Henry J. Kaiser Park in downtown Oakland. And as a former Bay Area resident, it's an honor she treasures.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. Thank you.
Don't give in, give. Inspiring words from an inspiring woman. And that is all for tonight. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good night.